Welcome back. What you should be seeing in front of you, or at least have open in front of you, is EViews, and I'm looking at essentially a blank screen, and that's basically the feature of EViews. I mean, what you need to do before you can work with EViews is actually create what they call a work file. And a work file, the definition of work file is rather straightforward. It's just simply a repository of your economic data. And a work file actually can contain a lot of economic data of many different frequencies, but generally speaking, we tend to break up the work file into little buckets of time series matrices, where each one of which is called a page file, and we're working with page files to produce a statistical model to either understand what's going on in the data or produce a forecast. So a critical tool or skill that you need to acquire before you can even begin with in EViews is to create a work file, and that's rather straightforward. You simply click on File, the File menu, then you highlight the work file area, and you just press using your mouse, and up comes this dialog box. Now, as you can see, I mean, what we're really doing is creating a repository of data, but EViews needs more information than just creating a file, say as Word does or Excel. It needs to know some specific information about your data set. And as I mentioned, in the case of Fiji, we're dealing with annual data, so obviously the first thing we need to focus on is indicating that this work file will have, in the first instance, annual frequency. We then need to indicate the start date, and it turns out that in this case it's 1970, if you recall, and I'm going to allow it to go all the way out to 2020, even though there's no data up until that point. That's for expansion purposes. So it's annual frequency, and the start date's 1970, and the end date is 2020. The work file here, where it says WF, all it wants is the name of the work file that will appear on the hard drive or the disk. So I'm just going to call it Fiji. And the page represents it's sort of like a section of the work file which will contain all of the Fiji data that you saw in the Excel spreadsheet. And that page will actually have the same frequency as the current work file has. But you'll see as we go through that you can actually have work files with many pages, and each page can have different frequencies, but more on that later. So I'm going to call this the Fiji data page file and press enter. And then you'll see, as we mentioned in the first video, in the preceding video, sorry, that basically you'll get a window output which is indicated that it created a work file. And let me try and show you some of the key features of this work file here. It created a work file called Fiji, and the name is indicated above there. It tells you actually right next to it the location of that work file on your drive, which is preceded by the path as indicated below in the base menu, in the base panel there. And the other thing that you'll see is that we have we have what's called a tab menu, which allows you to do various operations on the objects in this work file. Now, this is a new work file, and I just want to point out some interesting attributes about it because it's critical for all of the course here. The first aspect of a work file that you need to focus on, the range here, is indicating essentially the maximum length of the data that can exist in this particular page file. Immediately below it is the sample, and that represents the section or the area or the subset of the range that EViews is going to use to compute any statistic that you call for. So the range represents the maximum dimension of the time series matrix. The sample, the current sample, represents the active area of the time series matrix that EViews is going to focus on in order to calculate various statistics. Now, another feature of the work file that's important is that it has, by default, before you create anything yourself, two objects. The first one is called C, And actually that's what we call a coefficient vector, and it's initialized with zeros in there. And another work file, if I simply, another object, if I simply double click on it, it opens up, and you'll notice it has NAs. So now what are these objects? Well, let me focus on the C, or the coefficient object. Basically, the purpose of this object is to keep track of the most recently estimated parameter estimates in any statistical procedure that you use in EViews. So, for example, if you're doing a simple linear regression with only 2 parameter estimates, after you've run that regression, they will be recorded basically in the C vector, and EViews will allow you to keep track of that. Now, the reason it does that is because we tend to use those numbers to generate forecasts later on. So these are all initialized to 0. Now, thirdly, then if you focus on the other object, which is called the resid, resid is short for residuals, or the most recently estimated residuals from a statistical procedure. So what EViews does is that after it runs any regression, it will save the most recently estimated residuals in this vector for you, so that you can actually refer to them in subsequent statistical operations. Okay, so there are 2 key objects that they have to exist in every page file, and they turn out to be fundamentally useful for when you're doing your work. Now, one thing you must do before you do anything else after you've created your work file is learn to save your work file, and to save it regularly. And the command, or the short command for doing that, is Control-S, keyboard command. You can use a menu command where you just simply do file save. But by doing that, essentially your work is saved permanently in the work file area. Okay, now, so just to give you an example of what's happening in the capture area, notice that as I created the file and opened up specific objects and then essentially tried to save the file, the capture command here was operating and reflecting essentially the equivalent command lines that are needed to replicate the menu commands that I just issued here using the mouse. And so that's very useful, because then I can actually make a copy of these commands and store them in a file, and then use that later on to replicate what I've just done. Okay, so what we just did here is relatively straightforward. We basically showed you how to create a repository for your data. Obviously, we haven't done any forecasting exercise and any statistical analysis, but this step is fundamental for you to begin that forecasting exercise. So thank you. In the next video, we'll actually start introducing or bringing data into this work file in preparation for a simple forecasting exercise. Thank you.